Scott Kennedy, and I'm director of the Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business at Indiana University. It's a distinct honor to be with you today. We're delighted also to be cooperating in this joint venture with the Center for International Business Education and Research, CIBER, in arranging today's events. And I want to thank Barb and her staff, Levon Schlegel and Richard West, for all the hard work that you all have put into conceiving and putting this lunch on. We look forward to continuing our cooperation with you long into the future. Now, before I turn to introducing our featured speaker, I want to take a moment to say a few words about the Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business. The center was founded in February of this year and is housed on the IU Bloomington campus. The purpose of the center is to bring greater attention to the full range of issues that meet at the intersection of Chinese politics and business. Now, ask anybody that does business with or in China, and they'll tell you that just about no issue they encounter is strictly economic. Politics is ubiquitous in starting a company, in manufacturing, distribution, sales, after-sales service. So whether you're a large multinational, a medium-sized producer from America's heartland, a Chinese state-owned enterprise, or a fledgling Chinese entrepreneur, you have to understand how China's political system works and how to work the system. No less important, business in China cannot help but be affected by the winds of international politics. Chinese exporters and American firms selling to China can be directly affected by China's commitments to the WTO, how the Chinese government and industry participate in the World Trade Organization and other international regimes, and by the vagaries of American politics, as we'll soon hear. Lastly, there is every indication that economic change within China and China's evolving place in the global economy are having a direct effect on China's political system. Not national-level democratization, but in more subtle yet no less important ways to its regulatory system, the behavior of individual leaders and bureaucrats, and the relationship between state and society. Capitalism is changing Chinese politics, just perhaps not in the way many expected. In short, our center is focused on analyzing how China's political system affects business behavior, on how China's relationships with other countries and involvement in international organizations affects the interests of Chinese, those from other countries and the regimes themselves, and on the effect of China's capitalist revolution on the country's political system. So I'm proud to say that as far as I know, we are the only academic organization anywhere in the US, Europe, China, you name it, with such a focus. Now, a good question is, well, how can we do this? Well, the answer is, quite simply, IU has a great group of scholars from multiple disciplines looking at these issues. 11 IU faculty are senior associates of the center, and let me introduce those that are here today. You already know Barb Flynn, who's the director of CIBER, and will be speaking in just a moment. Also from the Kelley School, Marjorie Lyles. And from the IU School of Law in Indianapolis, Jeffrey Grove. Is Bob Lancaster here? He's not here. He was going to be. Okay, all right. We'll see him this afternoon. We're also lucky to have a visiting scholar from China at the center, the director of China's most important research center for the study of NGOs, Deng Guosheng. And we also have a postdoctoral fellow, Junmin Wang, who is a specialist on China's state-owned sectors. So if you want to know about tobacco, the tobacco industry in China, she is the authority. Now, in terms of activities, the mission of the center is to help our senior associates and visitors pursue research both individually and collectively, and then to disseminate the results of our efforts through writing, conferences, and lectures. And in addition, we also want to generate greater awareness of the issues that meet at the intersection of politics and business by bringing in outside leading experts, both for the benefit of the scholars associated with the center and for the broader Indiana community. In that spirit, we are really putting Bob to work today. After this luncheon, we'll take him down to the Bloomington campus for another lecture, and then out to dinner where I presume he'll get a little bit to eat and be quizzed a lot. So Our goal is to speak to multiple audiences, academia, the business world, and the policy community. So you'll continue to hear from us in writing and through events such as today's. And information on the Center's activities and its scholars are on our website, www.indiana.edu/RCCPB. All right. Now, before I introduce our speaker today, let me turn the floor over to Barb Flynn, the Director of CIBER, who would like to say a few words. Barb?
Well, thank you very much, and on behalf of the IU CIBER, I'd like to welcome you to this. We're very excited about this presentation. It sounds like such an interesting topic. China, as a partner, is of critical importance to the business community in Indiana, and I think will continue to be. So it is a topic that's very important to all of us. Just a few words about what we are. We're the Center for International Business Education and Research, which is one of 31 CIBERs located around the country at leading business schools. So we are working in conjunction with other business schools and with other centers that are devoted to international business education and research. Indiana University and the Kelley School are dedicated to providing research and support to Indiana businesses as they continue to advance in the international business community. As Scott said, we have world-class researchers that are working on research related to important issues, and through CIBER, we exist to help provide support to the business community as well. We try to view ourselves as becoming a major resource for the business community as they work on globalizing and opening up new markets. We're a clearinghouse for resources, and also are interested in doing more programming on interesting topics like this, such as talking about the political climate in a particular region of the world and what the implications are for Indiana businesses. In the next few months, CIBER is going to be working with a lot of local businesses to develop more programming to help address your international business needs. Our contact information is on the back of the program that you have at your place, and we invite you to get in touch with us and let us know what sorts of future programming you'd be interested in, or if you have any other comments and that can help us as we move forward. So thank you very much for being here, and I'm going to turn this back over to Scott.
You'll notice that on your tables you have cards, question cards, and if you have a question that you've thought of already or that you're prompted by today's talk, please write it down. We'll collect those and then use those for the Q&A after the formal remarks. There's no better person to help launch our center and the cooperative relationship between our center and CIBER than Bob Kapp. Now, you wouldn't have expected this from Bob's original career trajectory. Bob received his PhD in modern Chinese history from Yale, and from 1970 to 1980 taught history at Rice University and the University of Washington. He was also editor of the Journal of Asian Studies from 1978 to 1980. But then Bob found his calling, or should I say, how to apply the skills he developed as a historian to business affairs. In 1979, he helped to found the Washington State China Relations Council, where he served as executive director for 8 years. And then from 1987 to 1994, he served as president of the Washington Council on International Trade. But Bob is best known for his leadership of the US-China Business Council, which he headed from 1994 to 2004. The council is the leading representative for US industry in China. And under his leadership, the council helped steer American businesses through the difficult days of annual consideration of China's most favored nation status and its application to join the World Trade Organization. As part of his job, Bob regularly met with China's senior leaders and testified before the U.S. Congress and privately met with officials across the legislative and executive branches. Bob has often been the object of high praise and occasionally severe scorn, but always massive and undying respect. Now, whether he deserved the praise or criticism is something you can decide for yourself, but the attention is well-deserved. Bob Kapp has played a historic role in shaping U.S.-China relations. Now, after leaving the council, Bob founded his own firm, Robert A Kapp Associates, which provides strategic advice to companies that do business in or with China. He also is a formal advisor to several firms, as well as to the Asia Foundation and the China Economic Quarterly, and I'm proud to say that Bob is a member of our center's advisory board. Now, the title of today's talk is, Will U.S.-China Relations Survive an American Election Season? Now, as a researcher, I wanted to prepare for today's talk, and so I opened a copy of Bob's 1983 book, Communicating with China. And on page 5, he remarks, let me read this to you. Americans tend to look at their interactions with foreigners by analyzing the way the other side behaves, while paying scant attention to the way they themselves behave. If only the Chinese can overcome bureaucratism, if only the Chinese can erect workable legal frameworks for trade, if only the Chinese can rid themselves of destructive political factionalism, etc., etc. We fall into the habit of viewing the future of U.S.-China relations at all levels in terms of what happens on the other side alone. Now, Bob, I hope you weren't planning to read that quote too.
I got another one.
Oh, but I can say that your words are as important today as they were then, and so we look forward to your elaborations on them today. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Bob Kapp.
I'm going to grab something out of my bag. Now that Scott has retrieved a rare copy of that long out-of-print book, I'm going to bring this book to the lectern as well. This is another book Scott knows well. But in the same vein, and since I did used to be a university professor, let me start by recommending something to read. A couple of years ago, CSIS, a think tank in Washington, put out a book called China in the American Political Imagination. It's really great. These are little 5- and 6- and 7-page papers. It's really great except for my own paper, which is about how business looks at China. That one you'll have to decide for yourselves. But the other essays are really wonderful and interesting, and I really recommend this book, China in the American Political Imagination. It's historical. It goes back to the way Americans thought about China in the 19th and 20th centuries before the communist takeover in 1949, and it then also touches on aspects of the way Americans have looked at China since we began to engage again with China after the Nixon visit in 1972, right up into the 2000s. So I recommend it to you. Well, when I left academic life and got into what turned out to be a 3-part career as a nonprofit association executive, that's a whole profession in the United States, where you raise money and you have a board of directors and you write a newsletter and you make members happy with you and you do programs and you receive visiting speakers and so on. One of the things that I quickly learned was that if you're going to do international business, unless you want to smuggle, you do it within a framework of policies set by governments. Every government, certainly ours, certainly China's, and everybody else's too, if it's a functional government, has a set of laws and rules and regulations and policies within which international business must be conducted. Otherwise, you're not allowed to do it, or you go to jail. And that is very true in the case of the United States. We live in a market economy and we live in a country with enormous freedoms, but international business is governed by law and in many cases by policies set by Congress and set through a political process in this country, principally at the national level. So anyone who's going to deal with, and this is particularly true with countries like China, where the history is ambiguous between the United States and China. It's not that we've been, blood brothers since day one, and it's not that we've been enemies since day one. It's a much more mixed picture. So anyone who is contemplating serious involvement with China, whether in a very highly sensitive technological field or elsewise, has to be aware of the political and the policy environment in the United States that may affect his or her business. China has been a hot topic in the United States for a very long time. It was a hot topic in the 19th century when missionaries headed to China in the hopes of converting China to Christianity and bringing China into enlightenment as they defined it and as Americans tended to define it at the time. China was a kind of a mythic dream of business people who saw there was then 400 million people out there, and thought, you know, why, if every one of them buys my piano, I'll make 400 million pianos and I'll be richer than I've ever been before. So there's the kind of myth of the China market, and there were both in terms of American ideas and ideals being exported to China, and also the hopes that China would become a huge market for American goods and services. So China bulked large in the popular imagination before 1949, and particularly during World War II, when we elevated China to the level of one of the four great so-called Big Four partners in the war against Germany and Japan. China, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain were the Big Four, and China, which was still a largely undeveloped economy at that time, was nevertheless raised in political stature and in American public perception through Time magazine and everybody else to be one of the great democracies that was going to win a better world after World War II. That all changed in the late 40s as the civil war in China resumed after World War II was over, and the communists took over the country in 1949. By the middle of 1950, we were at war with China in Korea. The assumption was that China was a pawn of the Soviet Union with whom we were just getting into the full-fledged Cold War that dominated America's view of the world between the late 40s and really 1990 or 91. We broke diplomatic relations, or we never did have diplomatic relations with the government in Beijing. We kept diplomatic relations with the government of the Republic of China, which had been defeated on the mainland and had fled to Taiwan, where it still claimed to be the government of all China, but temporarily residing on this small island off the coast of mainland China. So from 49 to 79, China was, we had no real political engagement with China, and China was sort of political death. When the communists took over in 1949, politicians in the United States, including some very well-known politicians from Indiana, as a matter of fact, asked very loudly the question, who lost China? And the answer was communist subversives in the United States undermined American government support for the Chinese nationalists and facilitated the triumph of the communists on the mainland. And China became just a politically off limits. Nobody wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole. We went into Vietnam in part because the perception was that we needed to stop Chinese expansionism into the breadbasket of Asia, namely the Indo-Chinese peninsula. And there again, the notion in the late 50s and into the 60s was that China was this looming and kind of precursor of the evil empire that we needed to prevent from expanding further, particularly because we perceived it to be a part of the larger Soviet-dominated communist empire. All of that changed again, or began to change again, when Richard Nixon, after some secret preparations, went to China in 1972, met with Chairman Mao Zedong, and electrified the world, and certainly the United States, by breaking the ice with China. By 1979, the United States and China had diplomatic relations. We put embassies in each other's capitals. We discontinued our formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, where we still have very strong and close economic and unofficial political relations, and even defense relations of an unofficial nature. And the United States and China embarked on the era that we're in today. China turned, after the Cultural Revolution and the chaos of the 60s and 70s, China turned to what they call reform and opening, a simple term for a very complex phenomenon. Reform was shorthand for introducing the market economy forces into a country in which, until that time, for years and years and years, the market economy was absolutely off limits, totally politically unacceptable. Profit-making banned, private property not allowed. After 1978 and at the beginning of 79, just as we normalized relations with China, China turned to bringing the market economy in and permitting people to, you know, keep their profits and reinvest them and do all the things, and many of the things we associate with a market economy. They started from a base of 0, and it's been a long evolution. But all you have to do is look at China today or watch television, and you know that the marketization of the Chinese economy has proceeded very far and has been heavily responsible for turning China into the manufacturing and commercial and financial behemoth which it has become already today and is becoming even more tomorrow. At the same time, China turned to opening, reform and opening. Opening was, after years of rigid isolation and keeping all foreign influences out, opening was opening the country to foreign investment, sending students abroad. You know, in 1967 and 68, if you managed to subscribe to a foreign or an American, let's say, magazine, and it got delivered to you in China, you were going to get hauled out and criticized or beaten for having illicit contact with American imperialism. If you took Time magazine or the Journal of the American Medical Association, all of that changed after '79, and China said, we open to the outside world. We will exchange with everybody. We will send our students abroad. We will develop our own ability to contribute to the world's heritage of science and technology, and they pursued it in a really, really big way. So the United States and China turned a big corner in 1979 and 80. The 80s were, you might say, the sort of golden age of this renewed U.S.-China relationship. There were difficult moments, of course, over Taiwan and some other things, but by and large, the 80s were, thus far at least, a kind of a golden age. The Chinese and the Americans pretty much stood together and plotted together to counteract the influence and the power of the Soviet Union. The Cold War was still very much underway. We had secret listening posts in Western China. We were sending defense technologies to China to include in their fighter planes. I mean, we and the Chinese had their own problems with the Soviet Union and had for many years, had even fought battles with the Soviet Union by the late 1960s. And so the United States and China came together in a kind of marriage of convenience under Nixon and later presidents. And the major object in geopolitical terms was to provide a kind of a counterweight and to hem in the power of the Soviet Union. So in that sense, China was off the hook in terms of American politics. The virulence of American politics toward China was muted after that time because the Soviet Union was the real bad guy, and we and the Chinese were working not always intimately, but nevertheless working together in real ways. At the same time, foreign investment, the doors to foreign investment opened, and American companies began saying, well, now they got, it's not 400 million, it's or about $1 billion, and I guess in 1980 it was somewhere around $1 billion. It's $1.3 billion now. Let's go and see what the market is. And so hotel companies started to think about establishing a tourist industry in China, and Boeing began selling airplanes, of course, as early as 1972. And from 1980 to 1990, the influx of American and other international businesses into China, both as exporters selling things to China and as investors beginning to put properties in China, whether it's hotels or something else, that influx grew very, very rapidly. And China responded very, very strongly to that. So the 80s were an interesting period in which things generally looked pretty good. We formed a commercial agreement with the Chinese in 1980 that laid out between the two governments the basic parameters within which our economic and trade relations would be conducted. And trade got off the ground, and people were pretty excited about China. And there was a certain feeling in the United States, again, that something that Americans like to think, that China was becoming like us. You know, that after all, you know, they're adopting capitalism, and they don't all wear blue clothes anymore. They're beginning to wear, you know, and they're going to the beauty parlor and having their hair done, whereas during the Cultural Revolution, everybody had exactly the same hairdo. There was this kind of feeling that China was sort of coming our way, and in some ways it was, not only our way, but the way of the developed world. That came to that was badly interrupted by the tragedy at Tiananmen in 1989. A tragedy which I think some of you remember and or at least know something about. Let me ask you if any of you has never heard of Tiananmen. You know, time is passing. There are lots of people in China who don't know what happened at Tiananmen in 1989 because they were born in 1985 and nobody talks about it and the government doesn't talk about it, and they're growing up, I mean, and saying, well, what, you know, and you talk about Tiananmen and they say, what's that? I think most Americans who are older than 25 probably, or older than 30 if they've had any education and exposure at all, had some recollection of the fact that there was a huge month-long demonstration in the Central Square in Beijing, which was ultimately, after the demonstrators refused to disperse at the request and at the order of the Chinese government, it was finally dispersed by force, and a number of people were killed, and the American and other news media were there watching it, and it was a real crisis. That changed the tone of American-Chinese relations very, very seriously and put China back into great political sensitivity. There was a terrific visceral reaction of disappointment and rage in the United States about what the Chinese government had, what was perceived to be, it wasn't even perceived to be, is what the Chinese government had done against its own citizens who seemed to be demonstrating for simple things like democracy. They had a statue that looked a little like the Statue of Liberty that all the cameras focused on, and so on. And several things came out of that. After Tiananmen, certain members of Congress, including the lady who's now the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, created a new annual congressional review of China's behavior and made it necessary every year for the president to reauthorize for 1 year MFN, standard Chinese tariff treatment, standard Chinese treatment of taxes on imports. The same tariff treatment we gave everybody, most of the countries of the world. Most favored nation means standard treatment. So in other words, if we give Britain and France and Argentina 3% tariffs on some product, you give them to China as well. Because of the complexities of American law, it was possible for the Congress to say, China is a non-market economy. Every year, the president is going to have to go back to the Congress and say, let's have 1 more year of normal trade treatment for China. Every year, Congress will have hearings and decide whether to give China regular tariffs or whether to put tariffs back up to the old 1930s levels, which would have made it impossible for China to sell into the United States. And so, beginning in 1990, every May, there was a furious, raging, screaming fight in the Congress about China. I mean, I had congressmen say, that government's a bunch of child molesters. You can't imagine the vituperation of some of these members of Congress. I won't name any names. And I'm not thinking of anybody from Indiana. No, I actually am thinking of one person from Indiana who said to me at one point, China hasn't changed in 25 years. We fought them in Korea, and so on. But he was not alone. And so all through the 1980s, there was an annual China battle in which Congress and certain members of Congress just indulged in, and sometimes with reason. I mean, you know, the human rights situation in China is not particularly attractive, to put it mildly, and there were other things that you could get exercised about. But the vituperation and the fury of it was just mind-blowing. Coming out of the U.S. Congress, you couldn't imagine people speaking this way about another country, short of something like Nazi Germany, and I think some of the people who were doing the speaking felt that there wasn't much distinction. So the 80s had that annual shouting match. Beyond that, business was deepening all the time. Foreign direct investment into China was going up very rapidly. Imports from China began to rise as China established the basic elements of a manufacturing economy and an export economy in the coastal cities, opening up more and more of these coastal cities to foreign investment and the establishment of production facilities for making products and selling them into the global marketplace. But it was, even so, it was a bumpier decade. In 1995 and 1996, there was a big crisis over Taiwan. I won't go into details, but at one point the United States sent a carrier battle group, which is a very significant piece of war-fighting machinery. I mean, it's lots of ships, out as a warning to the Chinese to keep their hands off Taiwan, because the Chinese were testing short-range missiles and dropping them into the water right off the coast of the island. And President Clinton sent a whole carrier with all of its support vessels and destroyers and everything else out into the region east of Taiwan as a demonstration of force, telling the Chinese to back off. Sorry, to back off. So that was a punctuation of some note. And then, in the late 90s, we got into huge fireworks. This was the time when Bill Clinton was getting into the worst of his political troubles, let's just put it that way. And there was a tremendous amount of huge partisan rancor going on that made Washington pretty poisonous. And one of the things that came up was an allegation that that the Chinese were stealing, they were doing two things, that the Chinese were putting money into campaign finance in the United States, and two, that they were stealing very, very sensitive military secrets from the United States. It was a huge scandal which resulted in the creation of a special commission of the Congress under Congressman Christopher Cox, who is now the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. There were just the most astounding allegations, day after day, week after week, month after month, about what was alleged to be Chinese espionage and Chinese theft of nuclear warhead secrets and so forth and so on. That was in 1990, end of 97, 98, and 99. Strangely enough, excuse me, then we accidentally bombed Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the American military action in the post-Yugoslavian civil conflict. We were taking air action against Serbia, and at one point we destroyed China's embassy. Right in the middle of all this tremendous political furor in the United States, we took out the Chinese embassy. The Chinese, to this day, do not believe that it was an accident. We explained that it was an accident, that we had the wrong coordinates, or we had the wrong image or something, and garbage in, garbage out. The Chinese still find that very hard to accept, but it was it resulted in great demonstrations in China. Our ambassador was sort of imprisoned in his embassy for 10 days while the streets were filled with angry Chinese demonstrators, and it was a period of enormous difficulty. Ironically, after all that political sensitivity, we got into the final negotiations in the fall of '99 and leading into the year 2000. We got into the very final negotiations over the terms that the United States would require of China if it were to enter the WTO and enjoy all the, make the commitments to the rules of the world trading system, but also all enjoy the benefits that came with being a full-fledged member of WTO. It was actually in November of that year, '99, that we negotiated the final bilateral U.S.-China agreement on all these commitments. China committed itself to huge changes of domestic and international economic behavior to get into the WTO. So as 2000 dawned, the mother of all battles broke out in Congress. And that was, are we going to stop the annual review of China's behavior and the annual renewal 1 year at a time of normal trade with China? Are we going to kill that once and for all and treat China like a full WTO member with no further review? It was an immense battle, one in which, of course, I had a role because I was running the Business Council at the time. Very, very politically sensitive. The anti-permanent NTR forces were very strong, led in part at least by organized labor, which already viewed China with enormous alarm, and also supported by people on the far, not even on the far, but on the right-hand side of the American political spectrum, who were primarily concerned with China as a growing security factor for the United States. Big battle. And in the end, the Congress did approve permanent normal trade relations. Now, in the course of that battle, all sorts of threats were made to members of Congress. If you vote for PNTR, you will be out of office on January 20th, 2001. You will be defeated in the November election. We will destroy you if you vote for PNTR. The whole point of my talk today is, after all that sensitivity and all those moments of real tension between the U.S. and China, in the immediate aftermath of this climactic political battle, which you can go back and read about in any newspaper, nobody in the 2000 election, nobody got elected or unelected over China. It was absolutely insignificant in the 2000 election. It was barely mentioned. I mean, in advance we had people, I heard senators say about some aspect of the political furor going on in my presence, this has legs, this has legs, the implication being now we got something we can really nail the administration to the wall with. Completely invisible in the 2000 election. And I learned something pretty important from that, which leads me to the title of today's topic, because I'm not sure it still applies. But I learned that the American people, at that time at least, for the American people, China remained too far away. Unlike the Soviet Union in 1946 and 1947 and 1948, where the American people were ready to commit the full resources of the United States to a limitless struggle against the power of the Soviet Union, essentially no matter what it took. China was just not in that category. That is, there was nothing so compelling about China, good or bad, but in this case bad, that would lead voters to say to their elected representatives or to their candidates, China is the #1 thing on my mind, and this is, and I want you to, and if you don't agree with me on this, I'm going to put you out of office, or if you do agree with me on this, I'm going to elect you to office. China was too far away. I remarked to the #2 guy in the Chinese embassy after that U.S.-China relations were going to survive because the United States was too important to China, market, lots of other things besides our market, but certainly that. And China was too unimportant to the United States. Well, he looked at me as though I were crazy. I mean, how could you say that to the #2 ranking diplomat in the Chinese embassy in Washington? And I said, no, let me explain. And then I tried to say to him what I just said to you, that the American people are not galvanized by China and are not prepared to commit the national patrimony, the national totality of American resources to some sort of existential struggle with China. It's just not going to happen. Now, and he settled down when I told him that, because after I just told him that China was too unimportant to the United States, I think he was prepared to be upset with me. But time has passed since then. Time has passed since the year 2000, and the question now is, does it still hold? Does China have real political legs? We'll hear about China again in the campaign. Every 4 years, China comes up. Bill Clinton bashed George Bush in 1992 for coddling dictators from Baghdad to Beijing. Well, Baghdad to Beijing, how time passes. That was 16 years ago already, can you imagine? And every 4 years, particularly, well, Congress always beats up on the White House over China. Even Democrats beat up on a Democratic president over China, as Nancy Pelosi did on Bill Clinton. But when Congress is owned by, or even one house of Congress is owned by one party, but particularly if Congress, both houses are owned by one party and the White House by the other party, it's just a recipe for China mayhem, no matter which party controls which, because the Congress gets a free ride. See, the Congress can bash on the White House all it wants, but it doesn't really have to legislate, and it knows that at the end of the day, the White House will keep the relationship on a fairly even course, which Republican and Democratic White Houses have always done. There's been great continuity in terms of the executive branch maintenance of this relationship. And but even when so now we have a Democratic Congress and a Republican White House, we're sure to get into some exciting things this fall in that regard. The question is whether it's the same old pattern, raise hell every 4 years, beat up on the White House, or whether this time around it's different. And there are a couple of things that have changed. For one, China is a much more powerful country now, and both economically and in a nascent sense, strategically, and certainly in the councils of the nations around the world. China has a lot of friends. China has done a very good job with its diplomacy of becoming a valued and respected member of the international community. Lots of developing countries find great markets in China and look at China with great respect. The United States has its own problems in the international community and in the diplomatic community, because of what's happened well, I won't elaborate on that, but you know what the problems are for the United States in terms of its global reputation now. So China's gained on us in some ways to the extent that it's an either-or. China has made some real inroads that were not the case in the year 2000. Moreover, the manufacturing power of China is clear to everybody. It was clear in the year 2000, but now it's really clear. And the sheer number of the trade deficit of the United States with China is an easy number to grasp onto, and everybody does and points to it. And third of all, of course, we have the events of this summer. The product safety scares, the toys, the dog food, of course. I mean, pets can mean more than just about anything. They certainly do to me. But also health and safety issues just generally. That is, I think, the biggest wild card. I said earlier that I didn't think, I thought U.S.-China relations would survive because ultimately the American people just don't care that much about China. It's just too far away. And that's not all good, but it's not all bad either, because it's better than everybody in some sort of hysteria about China. Toys for kids is a different thing, and the question of whether China becomes perceived by Americans, ordinary Americans, as a menace to the United States because of this influx of goods from China, which are potentially dangerous to the health and safety of American citizens, is perhaps the most politically sensitive one of all. My own bet is that we'll have another round of screaming and yelling, but ultimately this political season is not going to rupture the larger trend in U.S.-China relations. It's not an easy relationship. There are tensions. There are tensions on the military side. There are certainly frictions and tensions on the economic side. And as you know, in the state of Indiana, there are tensions within American communities that have felt the impact of China's growing manufacturing power. Those things are there. It's not all sweetness and light, but it is a remarkably far-ranging and in many ways very cooperative relationship, which has been maintained by president after president from President Nixon on forward. My hunch is that even the food and product safety scare is not going to turn Americans on emotionally to the negatives about China that China becomes a central factor in the election. And the China policy, therefore, is significantly affected by the outcome of this fall's elections. Now, there are people who disagree. I think, to name a name, if you read the statements of the new senator from Ohio, Senator Sherrod Brown, who has been thinking about China for a long time, I mean, Sherrod Brown and a number of other people on the Democratic side say, listen, the 2006 election was very, very heavily about trade and about things like the China threat to our economy. And we're not going to, when we take over, we're going to see that things are really very, very different. The Democrats haven't, I think, worked that out for themselves yet in terms of how they please multiple constituencies, because the Democrats have lots of other constituencies for whom China is a great economic benefit and for whom China represents enormous opportunities for growth, as it does for companies in Indiana and many, many other states. So I'm not sure whether Senator Brown's views will prevail or not. My hunch is ultimately they won't, or at least they will be toned down to the point where our relationships with China, on the U.S. side at least, will not be turned upside down as a result of this fall election. But you can look forward to some loud fireworks, and I hope by going back in history a little bit today, I've given you a sense that this is part of an ongoing tradition, and that you shouldn't run for the exits. If you're a China business person, you shouldn't run for the exits and say, that's it, it's all over, listen to what they're saying, because in some ways the forces that hold the United States and China together in this strange embrace are now so strong that quadrennial political rhetoric is unlikely to make too heavy a dent in them. Let's see if you have any thoughts of your own that you'd like to raise with me on any topic, and I'll do my best. But Scott, thanks for having me, and Barb, thanks for having me.